Hello everyone and welcome to today's Perfectionism Workshop. So we are Danielle and Spiros and we are psychological wellbeing practitioners.
Hi everyone, welcome to our workshop.
So today's workshop is going to be introductory to perfectionism and it's going to be based on principles of CBT, so cognitive behavioural therapy, and should last for approximately 1 hour today. So here you've got some urgent support numbers, and this is for if you do experience any forms of self-harm or suicide, which can be quite common for a lot of people when experiencing symptoms of anxiety or depression. So here you might want to pause and take a photo of the slide if you'd like to use these numbers at any point. So today's workshop is going to be an introductory workshop to perfectionism, and we're going to be covering different topics and skills on overcoming perfectionism. So part 1 is going to be all about defining and understanding perfectionism. Part 2 is going to be about preparing for change. Part 3 is going to be really specific techniques to overcome perfectionism, and this will be based on CBT principles. And then last of all, we've got the goal setting and further reading and how to actually put some of these techniques and strategies into practice in your own life. So the first half are going to be quite theoretical, so parts 1 and 2, and parts 3 and 4 are going to be more practical. And what we'll do is we'll ask for you to pause the video or record notes throughout this workshop on some of the things that we'll be discussing today. So we're going to start with part 1, which is going to be all about defining and understanding perfectionism.
Brilliant, thank you, Danielle. So as Danielle said, we'll start this workshop by kind of thinking about really what perfectionism is and how it's defined, and trying to get a better understanding of what it means in our lives. So for a lot of us, perfectionism might mean something different, and I think this might be a good time to actually pause this video and have a think about what perfectionism means to you. And to help you consider that, some questions that you could be asking yourselves is, of course, what is perfectionism, but also what does it mean for me? How do I experience my perfectionism? And likelihood is that you'll have those answers coming, otherwise you probably wouldn't be listening to this workshop today. So feel free to take a brief break here to think about that yourself. So if you're coming back from your brief pause, I'll read out the actual official definition of perfectionism. So perfectionism is the setting of and striving to meet very demanding standards that are self-imposed and relentlessly pursue those despite this causing problems. It involves basing one's self-worth almost exclusively on how well these high standards are pursued and achieved. And as you'll see on this next slide, there are 3 key parts of perfectionism. And these are the fact that those high demands that we are looking to achieve are, we're setting them ourselves. So it's not that someone else is particularly asking us to do those things. They're kind of self-imposed. And they, of course, are really demanding, which means that they're really, really difficult to attain. And we might become really self-critical of ourselves when we're not able to achieve those high standards, which almost feeds into feeling even more self-critical about ourselves. And then the next really important bit of perfectionism is the fact that it makes us strive to meet those demands despite the negative effects that we might be experiencing due to doing that. So in the pursuit of meeting those really difficult and difficult to achieve demands, we might start experiencing quite negative consequences in terms of our thoughts or our emotions, but we might still keep going just because of how our perfectionism works. And then lastly, we have the basing our self-evaluation on those high standards, which often means that we base too much of our self-worth on what we do rather than who we are. and kind of and our self-worth then becomes really dependent on achieving those standards rather than who we are as people. And then, as you can see in this next slide, there are a lot of different areas that kind of people can experience perfectionism in. So some of these areas are things like our hygiene, or our weight, our work performance, our relationships, many different things. And we might be experiencing perfectionism in some of those areas, but not others. So this is another time in this workshop that you might want to pause this video and have a think about which of these areas you're experiencing perfectionism in. And if you're coming back from your pause, what we'll see in the next slides is that perfectionism is actually a continuum. It's not either I have perfectionism or I don't. And you might be really high on this scale on perfectionism in one area of the ones we saw just before, and not very high on another. So the reason why this continuum is really important is because sometimes perfectionism traits can be quite useful. For instance, if you're if you're striving to do well, then that can be particularly helpful, as it might prompt you to take appropriate action to make that happen for yourself. And then, for instance, kind of wanting to do well on an exam, for example. So if you are having some of the healthy perfectionism, then that might mean that you prepare well, you study sufficiently, and then you go sit the exam and do well. Whereas if your perfectionism is too much on the unhealthy side, then that might mean that it will make it harder for you to take that action, because you might feel paralyzed by all the anxiety and how demanding the standards that you're setting for yourself might be, therefore kind of defeating the purpose of having those traits, making them not very productive or useful for us. And in terms of kind of, we'll be now looking at what the cause of perfectionism is. And as you probably can imagine, research has shown that perfectionism is a good mixture of both our genetics, so things that we're predisposed to, and our early experiences in terms of the way that we've interacted with our environments growing up. So the thing is, it's not particularly important knowing exactly what has caused perfectionism for different people, as the therapies and the techniques that are used and have been shown to have really good results for perfectionism are not particularly interested in the cause. They are rather more about what effects perfectionism can have in our lives and how those same effects can maintain perfectionism. And some of those you can see on the branches of this tree on the slide we're looking at, which are our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors, and our physical sensations. And when you're experiencing perfectionism, likelihood is that in some of those areas, you will be experiencing some negative consequences or negative effects. And in experiencing those, that's what also maintains perfectionism, because you'll go through a cycle that I will kind of be showing you in our next slide. So in this next slide, what we're looking at is the basis on which kind of the CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is based. And in terms of kind of how we conceptualize psychological distress through the CBT model, what we kind of consider is that things happen in a cycle, like the one that you can see on the slide right now. And the 4 points of that cycle are our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors, and our physical sensations. So often when we what we expect that cycle to look like for people that are experiencing perfectionism is for their thoughts, for instance, to have kind of high self-criticism, to be ruminating about past mistakes or things that they didn't do well enough, or kind of setting really high standards for themselves. And often those thoughts will kind of affect the way we feel in our emotions, making it more likely for us to experience anxiety or depression, feeling quite critical about ourselves. And then often those emotions can have a negative effect on the way we feel in our bodies, the way we feel physically. So if we're really anxious due to our perfectionism thoughts, we might start having kind of symptoms like insomnia or an upset stomach or other manifestations of anxiety, kind of like our heart rates being really elevated, or feeling quite dizzy or breathless. And of course, all those three points of the cycle being really interlinked with each other will translate into behavior and affect the things we do, or make us not do things in order to kind of manage our perfectionism. And things that we might do as a response to these other points in the cycle, it might be things like checking that to make sure that we're not making mistakes, or procrastinating in order to avoid having to deal with the immense anxiety that those kind of perfectionism traits and standards is triggering for us. So this is kind of the basis on which all the techniques that we'll be discussing are based. So it's really important to kind of think of that cycle. And what you might want to do as well at this point of the video is just kind of pause here and have a think about what your particular thoughts, emotions, behavior, and physical sensations are when your perfectionism is triggering this cycle for you. And we'll now be moving on to the second part of our workshop today, which will be very focused on preparing for change.
Thank you, Spiros. So now that you've had a chance to have a look at your own cycle, it's now time to start thinking about how we start to actually prepare for change and to make those changes. Because I guess ultimately therapy is about making changes to our behaviours, to our beliefs, and to our lifestyle. But I guess we know that change is not an easy thing to do, and it can really mean, examining our long-held beliefs and our habits, which may have actually emerged for a reason and could have some still really useful functions in your life. But I suppose it's about also recognizing that some of the way we might be behaving and the way we might be thinking could also be having quite damaging consequences in our life as well. So changing perfectionism tendencies is definitely not an easy thing to do. Even after identifying all the sort of negative consequences that might come as a result of your perfectionism. So I guess when we think about, preparing for change, it's about asking yourself, first of all, do you want to overcome perfectionism? What sorts of changes do you want to make? And I guess these are really important questions to ask yourself, but ones that might actually also be really difficult to answer, because there might be lots of different fears and concerns about making some of these changes, and this can be completely normal. So I suppose what we're going to do is think about the concerns around change, which might be quite helpful, and we're going to think about particularly barriers to change, thinking about what change might actually involve, and thinking about the importance of changing as well. So first of all, thinking about our barriers to changing. So we have to remember that perfectionism is really reinforced and rewarded and quite valued by society. So if you think about particularly maybe in a workplace, people can be praised or rewarded for working really hard or having high standards. And there can be also, fears about lowering these standards or becoming a second-rate person. So one of, the most common concerns that people can have when overcoming perfectionism is that you're having to sort of give up or lower your standards. And that can be quite a scary concept for a lot of people. But I suppose it's all about, why would I want to change this perfectionism if this is going to be my feared outcome? So, if I lowered my standards, I might not be able to achieve the things that I want to in my life. Or if I lowered my standards, other people will think I'm lazy or I'm not doing well enough. So it's really important to start to, first of all, examine your own barriers to change, because this can be a really important step to then actually making the change. So you might want to pause the video here to think about what are your own barriers for change. So after you've done that, it might be about thinking about what change actually involves. Because when we're thinking about changing and overcoming perfectionism, it's really not about lowering standards, but it's more about addressing how much dependence of your own self-worth that you're placing on striving and achievement. So it's about giving you a bit of a choice how to live your life, considering what's best for you and those around you. So it's not with the aim at all about trying to get rid of striving for standards, but more so to think about reducing the dependence of your self-esteem on striving and sort of achievement, so that you can choose what standards you want to pursue and which ones you want to use a little bit more flexibly. So instead of maybe having them as sort of rigid rules, more sort of using perfectionism as a guideline and something that you might choose to follow instead of things that you have to follow. So when we're thinking about the techniques and strategies that we're going to come to later on in the video, we might want to think about sort of encouraging you to try and make some small changes. And when we do make those small changes, actually examining, did the worst thing happen for you? Or did you actually get some really pleasant surprises? So I suppose when we're coming back to the continuum that we discussed earlier, it's all about trying to tread more into that grey area rather than, say, having that sort of black and white type thinking. So thinking about some pros and cons of changing. So this can be a really, really helpful exercise to do, to think about what are the pros and cons of changing perfectionism. Because I guess sometimes it can be the idea of changing perfectionism can be one that we might approach with really mixed feelings. And often we can sort of be caught between fearing the consequences of changing and also wanting the benefits of the change. So one thing that we can do is help us to think about what are the pros and cons of keeping things as they are, so not changing perfectionism at all, and maybe what are the pros and cons of making the changes to your perfectionism, and what your life might look like in different areas in the future without the change and with the change. So we're going to start to have a look at some of these, which will be on the next slide. So this might be something that you might want to draw out for yourself. So often people might draw a box with 4 squares, and you might want to think about what are the rewards of perfectionism and what are the negative consequences of perfectionism. So here on the example, you can see that some really common rewards of perfectionism might be, being really organized, being the one that people can depend on, getting the praise from other people, which of course then reinforces us to keep our high standards. It might make us also feel a sense of control, and also making us feel that we are being successful in the career that we have chosen. We might get a strong sense of achievement also, and that sort of sense of structure. And ultimately, I guess that all makes us feel quite pleased with ourselves. So these are some really strong rewards of perfectionism. But I guess on the other side, we might also have some really negative consequences of perfectionism, which might be the resulting anxiety and depression that might happen if we don't achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves, or sometimes social isolation. So if we're constantly trying to achieve the best that we can, we might actually not bother to engage with our social engagements. We might cancel plans because we're trying to focus so much on our achievements. That can also lead to exhaustion, insomnia, physical health problems. We might also find that we might procrastinate and sort of never start or finish particular tasks if we don't feel that we're going to be able to do it to the best of our standards. And this might sort of increase our self-criticism. It might cause lower self-esteem, poor concentration, and also muscle tension and feeling tense all the time. And also some feelings of suicide some people might experience also. So it might be good for you to draw out some of these consequences and rewards for yourself, to think about, how perfectionism is sort of constantly contributing in your life. So you might want to pause the video here to do that.
So we've gone through the first couple parts of our workshop today, which, as we said, were going to be the more theoretical ones. So now, hopefully, you will have gotten a better kind of understanding of the psychoeducation around perfectionism, and you'll have been able to kind of link some of those things that we discussed just now with your own experience of perfectionism, and some of them will fit with how you've been kind of experiencing your own perfectionism traits. And in the second part of the workshop today, we'll be focusing on the specific techniques for us to overcome our perfectionism. And as we've mentioned a couple of times before, those techniques will be based on the cognitive behavioral model, which means that we'll be looking at the at how our cycles in terms of our thoughts, emotions, physical sensations, and behaviors can be affected by perfectionism, and how we can make changes in those different aspects of that cycle to make it easier for us to manage those symptoms, but also turn that cycle from a negative one to a more positive one. As I explained before, when we're looking at that cycle, all those different bubbles on it are really interlinked with each other, and they can affect each other either in a negative way when we're going through a negative or vicious cycle, or in a positive way when we manage to turn that cycle to a more virtuous one. So if you make change to one area, that is likely to make a change to another area. For instance, if you change your behavior in response to your high standards of perfectionism, that might change the way you think about yourself or your skills in situation as well. So that's what we'll be looking to kind of explore together, how to kind of make that happen. But of course, making those changes in your own cycle can often be easier said than done. So we'll be having a look at those techniques that can help us make that happen. But of course, those are new skills that you'll be learning. And as with every other new skill, they will take a lot of practice and kind of trial and error for them to kind of, for you to be able to use them in the most productive way. But another thing to kind of consider here is that today's workshop is very kind of introductory to perfectionism and how to manage it. Therefore, some of those techniques either will sound too specific or some might sound too general. So this is very important as an introduction to get an idea of what techniques you might be able to use, and think for yourself which ones might be most useful for you. And of course, towards the end of this workshop, we'll be sharing some other links for further information that you can access to get some more kind of specific information around perfectionism as well. But the first thing that we'll be thinking about, if you recall the cycle that we discussed, one of the bubbles on there was behavior. And that's the first one that we'll be thinking about. And that's usually the first bubble that we try to tackle when we're talking about kind of making change on that cycle. And the reason for that is because even though it's not particularly easy to change behavior, it's easier to change than any other aspect of that cycle. Because with behavior, if you think about it, you have conscious control of what you choose to do or not do. Whereas if we were to say you would try to change your emotions, it's not as easy to not feel anxious, for instance, right? Whereas with behavior, if you make a conscious decision to make a change, that can happen a bit easier. So what we'll start looking in terms of kind of making those first steps to change our behavior, the first thing to do is to identify unhelpful behaviors. And our behaviors can be both things that we do as a response to our perfectionism, or it could be, so we'll call those things our safety behaviors, or it could be things that we don't do or avoid doing because of our perfectionism, and we'll call those things avoidant behaviors. So some of those behaviors we might do because they feel like the natural thing to do in the moment. For instance, if you're feeling really tired, you'll want to kind of rest more. So if you're feeling really anxious, you might want to put things off to not experience that anxiety. So in the short term, it provides you with some relief, and therefore it feels like the right thing to do. However, in the long term, it can have a really negative effect because it will make things accumulate and become even harder for you to manage in the long term. So it might be worth questioning whether our coping strategies or the ways that we try to manage the way we feel may be useful or might be backfiring. Um, and there are some common ones called kind of unhelpful behaviors that we'll be looking at in the next couple slides. So if we kind of start with that, if you can look at this next slide, there's the doing behaviors, which we can you can find elsewhere being kind of called safety behaviors. And these are things like excessively organizing or making lists, correcting others for really kind of minor mistakes, seeking for reassurance to help you kind of ease your anxiety, or excessively checking for things to make sure that you haven't made mistakes. So in small doses, these things are not inherently wrong or problematic. So you might want to check your work before you submit it to make sure that you haven't made any mistakes. However, that can become quite problematic when you spend so much time checking that you never feel reassured and you always have to go back to check again and again, meaning that it takes a lot of time for you to prepare for things or to be able to finish your tasks. And then you might end up missing deadlines, or you might constantly feel fearful that you have made mistakes, therefore always kind of doubting that you're doing well enough. And that links back to not being able to meet those high standards that you might be setting for yourself. And then on the other side of that, we have our avoidance behaviors, which could be things that you would either find more difficult to do because of your perfectionism, or you would just avoid doing to, as a response to kind of how anxiety provoking perfectionism can be. So these are things like procrastinating, waiting until last minute to do things, finding really hard to make decisions, being really indecisive, not delegating work to avoid other people making mistakes, or completely avoiding what he might have to do. And the reason why these avoidant behaviors are particularly important to change is because they almost rob us of the opportunity to build up our own confidence in our abilities to cope with the anxiety we might be experiencing. So for instance, if you have something to do and you feel really anxious about doing it wrong or not well enough, and then because of that anxiety, you end up not doing it at all, what is happening there is you're not actually going through the task to experience that what you're really afraid might happen might actually not happen. Or if you're considering that you don't have the skills to cope or do well, you will never actually get the opportunity to test that theory and potentially learn that you are able to cope and you are able to do those things until you make kind of those, until you engage with that feared situation, which if you do well, will also help build your confidence in your own skills and abilities. And eventually by kind of going, stopping avoiding those things, you will slowly become more and more confident in yourself, making this less of a problem in the long term. And now kind of that was more around behaviors, and now we'll start thinking about kind of how to change our unhelpful thinking, which Danielle will talk you through.
Thank you, Spiros. So now we're going to start having a look at unhelpful thinking. And if we're thinking back to that cycle that we covered really early on in the workshop, thought is also a really important part of perfectionism. And it's often about thinking about, what do we say to ourselves? And what we say to ourselves can really affect the way we feel and then ultimately how we behave as well. And especially in perfectionism, I guess thinking can start to become really negative or quite narrow-minded or repetitive. And sometimes it can be quite extreme or biased as well. So, for example, if you have a look on the slide, you can see that, if you're criticizing yourself for not doing well enough or sort of constantly thinking you're a failure, this can really sort of affect the way you feel, and you might feel really anxious or you might feel depressed constantly, and this can have a really big impact on the way you might behave. So ultimately, we can create the meaning of a situation by the way we evaluate and interpret and think about the event or the situation that might have occurred. But we have to remember, and one key point to really, really emphasize here is that we have to remember that our thoughts are just facts, and often they are just our opinions or our interpretations of events. And often they are not only they're not the only way to see things, because often we think according to how we might be feeling. So one thing that we can do is try to really become more aware and examine what we might be thinking, because unhelpful thinking styles and patterns can have a big impact on the way we might feel and also at our behaviour. So a really, really helpful thing to first of all do is have a look at some common thinking styles, which we're going to cover on the next slide. So here you're going to see lots of different common thinking styles in perfectionism. And often the way we might be feeling, so that emotion that we might be feeling, so for example, it could be anxiety, it could be irritability, it could be low mood. This really can fuel or sort of hijack our thoughts almost, and lead us to become really stuck in some unhelpful ways of thinking about things. And we might have had these ways of thinking for a number of years, and they can start to become really unhelpful thinking habits and can give a very sort of biased or one-sided view of the situation. So it'd be good to first of all have a look at some of these together. So here you can see, for example, catastrophizing. So thinking the most terrible thing or consequence is going to happen. So those sort of what if questions: what if this happens? What if that happens? You've got here sort of personalization, so taking on full responsibility for an event without actually considering all the other factors involved. You've got shoulds and musts, so really, really rigid rules. So I must be doing this, I should always be doing this. And this can also make us feel like we haven't got that choice, which is what we were talking about earlier on in the workshop, if you remember. And we've also got labeling, for example, so using really negative or harsh or self-critical labels about ourselves. So I'm really stupid, or I failed, or I'm a fraud. And there's all the others that you can have a look at yourself. But I guess what we want to do is really identify what are some of the thinking styles that actually I fall into. And once we start to notice them, this can really help us to challenge some of these thinking styles. But I suppose if we don't even recognize that we might be thinking in these ways, it's really, really difficult to challenge them. So it might be good to first of all get into the practice of actually monitoring some of these thoughts. And here you might want to pause the video first of all to think about whether you recognize or relate to any of these thoughts yourself. So hopefully you've now had a chance to have a look at some of the thinking styles that you might fall into. And here we're now going to think about what the thought challenging method is to challenging some of these unhelpful thinking styles. So it really does have a two-step approach to this. And step one here is all about thought monitoring, which is similar to what I was saying in the previous slide about starting to recognize actually when we're starting to fall into these really, really unhelpful thinking styles. And I guess thought monitoring really does involve, first of all, identifying our thoughts and becoming more aware of monitoring our thoughts, because that really is the first step to changing. So monitoring just allows us to give us some distance from some of our thoughts to view them at an objective state. And here we might be able to then identify whether we're using any of the unhelpful thinking styles that we examined before. And to do that, some really, a really helpful question that you might want to ask yourself is, what was going through my mind at the time? What sorts of thoughts was I thinking at the time? And you might also have some images come into your mind that can be quite common as well. So, being pointed at or shouted at by your manager, or your manager calling you into the office, or, getting a big F on your exam paper, or seeing sort of a failed exam paper. So these can be some examples of things that you might experience. And it's quite good to record some of these thoughts or images down to actually recognize, okay, what does this actually represent? What sorts of unhelpful thinking styles might I be using here? And then we can start to think about the effect that that has on our emotions and the way we might behave. So you might want to have a look at a monitoring diary, which you can sort of find online, and help yourself to monitor some of these thoughts. So we've got an example here, and here we've got Nina, who is using a monitoring diary to sort of examine some of her thoughts. And this is something similar to what you might use in your own life. So here you can see the situation, which is that she was making a dessert for a dinner party. The sorts of feelings that she was experiencing at the time was sort of feeling anxious, feeling frustrated, feeling really, really sad. And the thoughts that were going through her mind was, the cake looks so bad, I'm a failure, I've ruined the evening, I should be a better host. So here you can hear those shoulds and musts, which is what we identified earlier. So here, what you could do to actually try to identify those unhelpful thinking styles is, actually pulling some of those out. So here you can see she was using labeling. She was also using discounting the positives. She was mind reading. She was using shoulds and musts. So that can be quite a helpful thing to do if you're struggling to identify some of your thoughts. And then you can see how that sort of resulted in her change in behaviour. So spending a lot of time in the kitchen and sort of overthinking how bad the cake was. And, as soon as, it can be really helpful for you to record these thoughts quite soon after the situation has taken place. And that can sometimes be challenging. You might want to use your phone to record it quickly, or you might want to jot it down on a piece of paper. But the sooner you can identify what your thoughts, emotions, and behaviours were after the situation has happened, the better. And some people can find it, also quite difficult to write things down. So it might be that you want to try recording your thoughts in a different way. So maybe drawing pictures or sort of recording on a dictaphone or a computer. And that might be a little bit more practical for you. So whatever method works better for you is fine. And the more you can start to recognize, catching some of these thoughts in real time, the more you'll then become skilled at and able to then identify the thoughts and challenge them, which is what we'll be coming on to later. And it can be really common that a lot of people, might actually struggle to write things down because they might think that it makes them feel worse. And feeling worse, and that can be, quite a common thing. And these difficult feelings do tend to pass. So, it's really, really helpful task to get to try and sort of start to write things down to sort of allow that feeling to pass. So now you've had a chance to have a look at thought monitoring, you might now want to have a look at some thought challenging, which is step 2 to the actual procedure that we're doing today. So again, coming back to the idea that our thoughts aren't facts and they really are just interpretations of events, we need to think about how we can start to change or sort of have a look for the evidence for and against our thoughts. And I guess this skill really relates to trying to gently challenge some of our ways of thinking and trying to view it from a different perspective. Because as we said, often our thoughts and the way we might think about things is really fueled by the emotion that we're feeling, but often it might not be representative of the situation that is going on, and also not a very helpful way to help us to manage the situation. So we can try to use a thought challenging record, which actually might help us to view our thoughts in a more positive or balanced way. So here you can see we've got Nina again, which is the example that we're going to use today. And this is essentially how we start to challenge some of our thoughts. So I'm going to just think about what the situation is, and I'm going to just tell you a little bit more about that. So Nina is a teacher, and she's very good at her job, and she really likes to do really well. And she's also a really sociable person, so she enjoys her friends' company a lot of the time. And her friends often tell her that she's a perfectionist, and sometimes she thinks it's a problem, but she does like things to be really perfect. And recently she's noticed that she's been feeling a lot more stressed, and she's been struggling with feeling quite low in mood as well. And Nina invites her friends round for a dinner party, and she makes a cake for the dessert, which she then thinks looks awful and looks really bad. So the thoughts that sort of goes through her mind is, that she feels like she's a failure, and she feels like she's ruined the evening. And the emotions that she's feeling at the time is feeling really anxious, frustrated, and sad. So as the evening continues, everyone had some cake. There was about a quarter of the cake left. And at the end of the evening, Nina's friends said that they had a really good time and the food was quite delicious. And Nina and her friends put another date in the diary for another event at Nina's house. So that's just a little bit of a context of what this situation is. But here we want to start to think about, how can I challenge the thought that I'm a failure and I've ruined the evening, which was the unhelpful thought that Nina has identified as a result of this situation and as a result of the way she's feeling. So here we want to take the thought to court, essentially, which is where we are trying to look for the factual evidence only that actually starts to challenge the way you might be thinking. And this is just to emphasize again that in this section, we should only be looking at the facts of the situation. So we shouldn't be using any opinions or anything that we, think. It should be really factual evidence that both supports and is against this thought. And if we have a look at the evidence for, first of all, the evidence for this situation and for the thought might be that maybe she has made better cakes in the past, and there might be evidence of that. Or the fact that actually not all the cake was eaten. So there was definitely evidence that, as we said, there was a quarter of the cake left. So there was some cake left over, which might support the fact that she's a failure and she might have ruined the evening. But it's also important to look at the evidence against the way we might be thinking. And this is often what doesn't happen when we're having unhelpful thinking styles. So the evidence against the thought could be that people did eat the cake and no one was sick, or no one said, oh, the cake was disgusting, or no one was really critical of Nina. The friends said they had a good time, and they also arranged another evening. So there's essentially evidence that we can come up with also against the way that she was thinking that she was a failure and that she's ruined the evening. So when we're now coming towards a more balanced perspective, essentially we're trying to examine both of the sides of the evidence and trying to come to a more balanced type of thought. So that might sound something like, I haven't failed as a person because of the dessert. It made no difference, and the evening overall was a success. So it's sort of taking into consideration both sides of the thinking and coming to a more balanced perspective. And sometimes that might be difficult. So if you're struggling to come up with the evidence, you might want to try asking yourself some questions. So, what would a friend say about this thought that you've had? Or how else might you want to view the situation? What is the positive information that I might be ignoring? Or what is the negative information that I might be ignoring? Is it helpful to have these sorts of thoughts? So essentially, we're just trying to come up with questions that might help us to come up with the evidence. So you might want to have a go at doing this, because it can be a really, really helpful way to start to challenge the way we might be thinking. So just a quick summary now in terms of the topics and the techniques that we've covered, as we've covered quite a few different ones that will help us to overcome perfectionism. So some of the topics that we have covered so far is all about looking at our motivation for change. So, looking at the barriers of changing, looking at the pros and cons of changing and also staying the same. We've had a look at changing unhelpful behaviours, which is really, really relating back to that cycle that we had a look at very early on. So looking at things that we might be doing, things that we might be avoiding, that actually might be maintaining the way we're feeling. And also, we lastly had a look at thought monitoring and challenging. So really starting to have a look at the ways we might be thinking, which could be unhelpful, and starting to challenge some of those unhelpful thinking styles. So we have covered these techniques fairly quickly. So it might be about reading back through some of the materials again, and having a look at some of the things that we've covered in a bit more detail and taking some notes.
Thank you, Danielle. So what we'll be doing in this last part of our workshop today, we'll be thinking about goal setting. And the reason why this is really important is because, as you've probably realized by now, in this workshop, we've mainly talked about things that we might be looking or might be important for us to change in the way that we manage our perfectionism. And those it's really important to think about kind of always going back to that cycle that we looked at towards the beginning of our session today, in terms of our thoughts, our emotions, behaviors, and physical symptoms, how they can all affect each other, and how making changes on one of them can really help positively affect the other aspects of that cycle. So I think obviously we talked about that those are kind of different skills that you're now learning about, and will be kind of looking to put in your toolbox to be able to in the future use those tools to manage your situation better. But things might feel kind of more difficult before they get better. And that's why kind of setting goals can be really helpful with us persevering and continuing to use those skills, even when our symptoms feel kind of more difficult because of making those changes. Change is not necessarily always easy. And that's why having something to keep us going can be really, really useful. And that's something for a lot of people can be our goals. And we'll be looking about how to kind of go about setting goals for ourselves that will be a helpful way for us to both keep going, but also to be able to kind of monitor the progress that we are making. So some questions to ask yourselves in terms of setting goals for yourselves would be things like, which areas of your life is perfectionism a problem? So thinking about one of the initial slides that we looked at with the different aspects of our areas of our lives that might be impacted by our perfectionism, and thinking about which one of those do you identify with? And then thinking about the continuum that we talked about, some of those areas might be really, really problematic. And some of them, there might be some perfectionism traits, but not to kind of a really distressing degree. So thinking about those different areas, and then thinking about setting different standards for yourself instead of those really hard to attain ones. So the next question for you to think about your goal setting would be, what would be a realistic standard for you? So what kind of things what kind of standards could you set for yourself that won't trigger that really distressing cycle of perfectionism for you? And then you could also consider what aspects of your perfectionism you would like to change. So thinking about what are these standards for yourself, or what are those symptoms that you're experiencing through your perfectionism traits that you might want to change. And that can always link back to those specific areas that we talked about in terms of your thoughts or your behaviors. And you can use those techniques that we discussed in terms of identifying negative or unhelpful behaviors and swapping them with more productive ones, or changing the way you think about your different situations and coming to a more balanced view of both yourself and the world. And then another thing you can think about is what would you like to be able to do differently in those areas? So if you were to change your behaviors, or if you were to change your thoughts, what would the alternative look like for you? What would you be swapping them with? And in order for you to achieve that, which strategies could you use, or which techniques and tools could you use to help you make those changes? And is there anything you've learned today that you could try to use for that to happen? But also there's kind of what we call SMART goals, as you see kind of at the end, at the bottom of this slide, which is a really simple way to make our goals easier to kind of achieve and measure. So SMART goals are goals that are really specific. So make it really specific what you're setting out to achieve. So say you want to procrastinate less, maybe kind of make it even more specific. So you won't spend more than X minutes on your phone, for instance, when you become anxious about a certain task. So that makes it really specific, which when a goal is very specific, it's easier to measure. So if you're setting a goal to not procrastinate for more than X amount of minutes, that's easily measurable. So you can look at your clock and see, have you spent more time than what you wanted to on procrastinating, on doing something else? And then also, by breaking goals down and making them really specific, you make them easier to achieve as well. And again, especially with perfectionism, when a lot of the time our standards for ourselves or the goals we set can feel really unattainable, this can be really important, as it can be an opportunity for you to tick off things on your to-do list, giving you that sense of achievement that you're doing something right and you're doing something well. And by setting SMART goals, you can also make them relevant and time specific. So relevant to your particular situation rather than a generic goal of just feeling better, for instance. So what a more relevant goal for you could be kind of working out what makes it so difficult for you to feel good with your skills at work, for instance. And you can also set a particular kind of timeline for yourself for when you want to achieve that by, to give yourself a sense of kind of accountability that this has to happen by a certain time. And that can be really useful in kind of keeping you going, working towards that goal. So again, just in terms of kind of things to consider when making goals, think about what your situation is, think about how you want to change it, and then also think about what your desired outcome for that will be. And now some kind of general tips about kind of what we discussed today around our perfectionism that Danielle is going to talk you through.
Thank you, Spiros. So thinking about some general tips and things that we have identified could be helpful is just taking a bit of time to actually define your perfectionism and identify the problematic areas. So we've done this a little bit over the videos, and there might be things that actually you can think of that we haven't covered that still fits into perfectionism. So really do take a bit of time to identify some of these areas. Also take a little bit of time to practice the techniques and the new skills often, as CBT really is about trying to develop new ways of coping, new ways of thinking, and essentially, you know, the things that you might have been doing before, they might have developed over years and years of work. So it's all about trying to learn the new techniques, and only by doing it often and repeatedly is that going to start to become a little bit more ingrained. Also, give yourself permission to make mistakes, because always with learning something new, there might be mistakes along the way. Keep reminding yourself of the negative consequences of unhelpful perfectionism. So sort of going back through those pros and cons and really understanding, you know, what are the negative consequences of why I keep feeling bad and why my unhelpful perfectionism is maintaining my difficulties. Reward yourself and be kind to yourself also. That's a really, really important thing to do when learning something new. And also think about how you might be able to support yourself and make changes. So thinking about further reading and what tools and techniques we might recommend. You've got Over Perfectionism, which is largely about the techniques that we've covered here today. You've got the Perfectionism Handbook, which also has some really helpful tools and techniques. And we also have some online tools and techniques as well that you might want to have a look at. And last of all, we wanted to say thank you very much for listening and taking part. And we hope you learned some really good techniques from today's session.
Yeah, just thank you for spending this time listening to us and going through this workshop. And we really hope that you found some useful tips and tricks to manage your situation better. Just to reiterate, as with every other new skill, these will be kind of things that you'll have to practice for them to kind of, for you to be able to kind of get the best out of them. And it's really important to just kind of reflect on which might be useful for you. And just kind of, if you need to go back through the slides again, then feel free to do so. Or if you would like to do the further reading, then you can always go back to the previous slide and have a think about that. So yeah, helps for spending. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we wish you all the best for the future.